The night was heavy with exhaustion as Diane Carter finally stepped out of Fayetteville General Hospital, her worn sneakers echoing against the empty parking garage concrete. Another 12-hour shift cleaning the corridors where life and death danced their eternal waltz, where she had mopped away traces of other people's pain while carrying her own quiet burdens. Her hands, rough from years of disinfectant and hard work, clutched her small purse close as she walked toward her old Honda Civic, the one luxury she'd allowed herself after Marcus enlisted and started sending money home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The streets of this small military town outside Fort Bragg were quieter than usual, as though the very air held its breath in anticipation of something terrible about to unfold. And as Diane turned onto Bragg Boulevard, her radio playing soft gospel hymns that had carried her through 20 years of widowhood, she had no idea that fate was already positioning the pieces for a collision that would shake the foundations of everything she believed about justice and protection. The red and blue lights appeared suddenly in her rearview mirror, cutting through the darkness like angry stars. Her heart skipped, not from guilt, but from the learned fear that comes to black women when authority approaches with flashing lights and loaded weapons. She pulled over carefully, hands visible on the steering wheel, breathing the prayer her deceased husband had taught her long ago, "Lord, let me get home safe to my boy." Officer Derek Mansfield stepped out of his cruiser with the swagger of a man who had never questioned his right to command, his badge catching the streetlight like a shield of invincibility. His partner, Officer Bradley, followed with the casual indifference of someone who had watched this performance too many times to care about the outcome. And when Mansfield approached Diane's window, his flashlight burning against her face like an interrogation lamp, his smirk already twisted with the cruel satisfaction of power about to be exercised. "License and registration," he barked, though his tone suggested this was not about traffic violations, but about something deeper, something that had festered in his soul since his father and grandfather had worn the same badge with the same arrogance. Diane's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her documents, her voice soft and respectful as she asked, "Officer, may I know why I was stopped? I don't believe I was speeding." And in that moment, Mansfield's eyes narrowed with the recognition of someone who dared to question, someone who had the audacity to speak when she should have simply submitted. "One of those military wives, huh? Think you're special because your boy plays soldier?" The words hit Diane like physical blows, but she maintained her composure, the same quiet strength that had raised Marcus alone after his father died in Iraq, the same dignity that had carried her through years of double shifts and sacrifice. "Sir, I'm just trying to get home from work. I haven't done anything wrong." But Mansfield had already decided that her existence was crime enough, that her quiet dignity was defiance, that her refusal to cower was an insult to his authority. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded, his hand already moving toward his baton as though eager to transform power into pain. Across the street, Maria Santos had been awakened by the commotion, her apartment window providing a clear view of the unfolding tragedy. A single mother who understood the vulnerability of being alone in a world that often showed no mercy to the powerless, she grabbed her phone with shaking hands, knowing instinctively that someone needed to witness what was about to happen. As Diane slowly exited her vehicle, her movements careful and non-threatening, Mansfield's aggression escalated with the speed of a man who had been waiting his entire career for this moment. "You think you can question me? You think your dead soldier husband makes you untouchable?" The first blow came without warning, Mansfield's baton striking Diane across her shoulder as she tried to protect herself, her cries of pain echoing through the empty street like a call for justice that seemed to fall on deaf ears. But Maria's phone was recording, capturing every moment of brutality, every unnecessary strike, every violation of the oath these men had sworn to protect and serve. And as Diane fell to the pavement, her uniform stained with blood and tears, she whispered the same words she had taught her son: "Never bow to injustice, even when you stand alone." What she did not know was that thousands of miles away, her boy was about to discover that standing alone was something neither of them would ever have to do again. The video uploaded automatically to social media platforms, spreading like wildfire through networks of outrage and solidarity, traveling across oceans and time zones until it reached the very person who would turn this moment of helplessness into a reckoning that would shake the foundations of power itself. The weight of command had never felt heavier on Williams's shoulders as he looked at his men. Ahmed with his quiet intensity, Ghost with his deadly calm, Chen with her unwavering moral compass, and Marcus with his world shattered but his resolve diamond hard. These weren't just soldiers under his command. They were the sons he'd never had, the family he'd chosen over blood relations. "The mission parameters have changed," Williams announced, his Mississippi drawl thick with emotion and determination. "We have American civilians under attack on American soil. That makes this a matter of national security." Ahmed was already working his technical magic, rerouting communications, creating digital smokescreens, and arranging transportation through channels that would keep their movement off official radar. "I can get us home," he said simply, "and I can make sure we have evidence when we arrive." Ghost began calculating logistics with the precision of a man who had planned countless operations. "We go in quiet, we assess the situation, we document everything, and we make sure justice gets served the right way." Chen packed her medical supplies with the efficiency of someone who knew that healing would be needed for Marcus's mother, for the community, and perhaps for their own souls after what they were about to do. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you were enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the unit began their unauthorized departure from a classified location, each man understood the magnitude of their choice. Court-martial, imprisonment, the end of their military careers. These were the prices they were willing to pay. For the woman who had raised their brother, for the principle that family is sacred, and for the belief that some things matter more than orders. The bond forged in combat was about to be tested in the crucible of civilian injustice, and as their transport lifted off into the night, Marcus Carter whispered a promise to the darkness. "Hold on, Mama. Your boys are coming home." The desert air was thick with tension and the weight of classified secrets as Sergeant Marcus Carter and his Special Forces unit prepared for what should have been another routine night operation in a location that officially didn't exist on any map. The team had been together for 3 years, forged in the crucible of combat into something more than soldiers. They had become brothers, bound by blood spilled and lives saved, by the unspoken understanding that each man's family was sacred to all. Captain James "Bulldog" Williams was reviewing mission parameters when Corporal Ahmed Hassan's encrypted communication device began buzzing with urgent notifications, the kind of digital chatter that meant someone, somewhere, was in trouble. Ahmed's fingers flew across his tablet with the precision of a virtuoso, his technical genius cutting through layers of security and privacy settings as he traced the source of the viral content flooding military social networks. "Captain," Ahmed's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of catastrophe. "You need to see this." The grainy cell phone video began to play on the tablet screen, and within seconds the entire unit had gathered around, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of digital injustice. There was Marcus's mother, the woman who had sent them care packages and handwritten letters, the saint who had raised their brother into the warrior he was, lying on the ground as police batons rose and fell like instruments of torture. Marcus's reaction was immediate and devastating. The disciplined soldier, the man who had faced enemy fire without flinching, crumbled to his knees as though the weight of helplessness had physically crushed him. His anguished cry tore through the night like a wounded animal, raw and primal and filled with the kind of rage that could move mountains or start wars. "That's Mama Carter," Staff Sergeant Tommy O'Brien said quietly, his sniper's eyes already calculating distances and angles, his mind shifting from military precision to something more personal and dangerous.
Ghost had grown up in Chicago's South Side, had lost his own brother to police violence, and the sight of Marcus's mother being brutalized awakened memories that no amount of military training could suppress. Sergeant Lisa Phoenix Chen knelt beside Marcus, her medics training kicking in as she assessed his emotional trauma, her own heart breaking as she watched the strongest man she knew reduced to trembling fury. "We're going home," she said simply, her voice carrying the authority of moral certainty. "We're going home right now." Captain Williams faced the impossible choice that would define not just his career, but his soul. His orders were clear: maintain operational security, complete the mission, preserve the integrity of their classified operation. But his soldiers were clear too. Their brother's mother had been brutalized, and brotherhood demanded action, regardless of consequences. "Sir," Marcus finally spoke, his voice hoarse with grief and determination, "I need to go home. She needs me, and I wasn't there. I promised my father I'd protect her, and I failed." The pre-dawn darkness of North Carolina felt different than the desert night they had left behind, heavier with humidity and hope, thick with the promise of justice delayed but not denied. Marcus Carter and his Special Forces unit had traveled halfway around the world in less than 24 hours, using military transport they had appropriated and credentials that Ahmed Hassan had digitally manipulated with the skill of a master craftsman reshaping reality. They moved through Fayetteville like shadows given substance, their training allowing them to navigate the familiar streets of Marcus's hometown without triggering the surveillance systems that monitored military personnel. These were not soldiers returning from deployment through official channels. These were warriors operating in the gray space between duty and devotion, between orders and honor. Fayetteville General Hospital stood before them like a fortress of fluorescent lights and antiseptic hope. The same building where Diane Carter had scrubbed floors and emptied wastebaskets for 12 years, never knowing that her son's brothers-in-arms would one day infiltrate its corridors to find her broken body in a recovery room. Marcus's hand shook as he pushed through the hospital doors, his combat-hardened composure finally cracking as he saw his mother lying in the narrow bed, her dark skin mottled with bruises that looked like storm clouds against her gentle features. The woman who had raised him with quiet strength and endless sacrifice now looked fragile and small, connected to machines that monitored the damage inflicted by men who had sworn to protect people exactly like her. "Baby," Diane whispered as Marcus knelt beside her bed, her voice hoarse from screaming during the assault, but still carrying the warmth that had sustained him through every childhood nightmare and adolescent crisis. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be deployed." The reunion between mother and son was a masterpiece of love and heartbreak, watched in respectful silence by 4 warriors who understood that they were witnessing something sacred. Marcus held his mother's bandaged hands with the gentleness of someone who handled explosives for a living, his tears falling like rain on the hospital linens as he absorbed the reality of her pain. "I'm here, Mama. I'm here, and I'm never leaving you alone again." Sergeant Lisa Chen stepped forward with her medical bag, her trained eyes assessing Diane's injuries with the clinical precision of someone who had treated combat wounds in war zones. But this was different. This was family, and the rage building in her chest threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. "Mrs. Carter?" Chen said softly, her voice carrying the respect due to a military mother. "I'm Lisa, one of Marcus's teammates. I'm a medic, and I'd like to take a look at your injuries if that's okay." As Chen worked, her gentle hands cataloging the damage inflicted by police batons, the rest of the unit began their own reconnaissance. Ahmed had already hacked into the hospital's security system, downloading footage of Diane's admission and the statements given to investigating officers. Ghost positioned himself at the window, his sniper's training allowing him to identify potential threats and escape routes with mechanical efficiency. Captain Williams stood at the foot of Diane's bed like a sentinel, his gruff exterior softened by the sight of a mother's pain, but his strategic mind already calculating the resources they would need to wage war against institutionalized corruption. This woman reminded him of his own mother back in Mississippi, another strong black woman who raised sons in a world that often seemed designed to destroy them. "Ma'am," Captain Williams said, her voice carrying the formality of military respect, "I want you to know that Marcus isn't alone in this. We're all here and we're going to make sure justice gets served." But Diane Carter, despite her injuries and exhaustion, was still a mother first and foremost. Her eyes, sharp with the intelligence that had navigated 20 years of single parenthood, moved from face to face as she recognized the magnitude of what her son and his team had risked. "You boys went AWOL," she said quietly, the statement carrying the weight of understanding rather than accusation. "You threw away your careers for me." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Mama, you threw away everything for me when Daddy died. You worked 2 jobs, you sacrificed your dreams, you made sure I had everything I needed to become the man I am. This isn't throwing away anything. This is honoring everything you taught me about standing up for what's right." Outside the hospital room, the machinery of injustice continued to turn. Officer Derek Mansfield was at the police station crafting reports that painted Diane as aggressive and non-compliant, while Chief Patricia Morgan fielded calls from city officials worried about liability and bad publicity. None of them understood that they were no longer dealing with a grieving family and community outrage. They were now facing a highly trained Special Forces unit with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, led by a son whose mother's blood cried out for justice from hospital linens, supported by brothers who understood that some battles are worth any sacrifice. As dawn broke over Fayetteville, Marcus Carter held his mother's hand and whispered the promise that would reshape everything. "This isn't over, Mama. This is just the beginning."
The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Fayetteville had become a nerve center of technological rebellion, where Corporal Ahmed Hassan transformed military-grade equipment into weapons of digital justice. His fingers danced across multiple keyboards with the precision of a concert pianist, each keystroke penetrating deeper into the corrupt heart of the Fayetteville Police Department's electronic infrastructure. "These bastards didn't just hurt Mrs. Carter," Ahmed whispered, his eyes reflecting the glow of computer screens filled with damning evidence. "They've been doing this for years." The body camera footage he had extracted told a story more horrifying than the viral video suggested. Officer Derek Mansfield's camera had captured everything. His cruel laughter, his deliberate escalation, his racist commentary that painted every strike against Diane as personal satisfaction rather than professional duty. But worse still were the older files Ahmed discovered, buried in archived folders that revealed a pattern of brutality stretching back through Mansfield's career like a trail of broken bodies and silenced voices. Staff Sergeant Tommy "Ghost" O'Brien moved through the shadows of Fayetteville like a specter of reckoning, his sniper training allowing him to observe without being observed. Through the scope of civilian surveillance, he cataloged the routines of every officer involved in his brother's mother's assault, their shifts, their hangouts, their vulnerabilities. These men who had hidden behind badges and union protection had no idea they were now being hunted by someone who understood patience as a weapon. From his perch on a rooftop across from the police station, Ghost watched Officer Mansfield exit the building with the swagger of someone who believed himself untouchable. The irony was not lost on the man from Chicago's South Side. He had learned to read predators in urban environments where survival meant understanding who posed a threat and who was merely posturing. "Target acquired," Ghost whispered into his encrypted communication device. "Mansfield's heading to Murphy's Tavern, same as every night this week. Man's got no situational awareness whatsoever." Back at their makeshift command center, Ahmed's technological wizardry had uncovered something even more damaging than individual corruption, a systematic cover-up that reached into the highest levels of the police department. Internal emails revealed Chief Patricia Morgan's knowledge of previous complaints against Mansfield, her deliberate decisions to bury investigations, her prioritization of department image over citizen safety. "Captain," Ahmed called to Williams, who was coordinating with local community leaders through encrypted channels,
You need to see this. We're not just fighting a few bad cops. We're fighting an entire system designed to protect them. The evidence mounted like a digital avalanche. Surveillance footage from other incidents, witness statements that had been buried, medical reports that had been altered, legal settlements that had been sealed to hide departmental malfeasance. Each piece of data Ahmed extracted painted a picture of institutionalized corruption that transformed individual brutality into systematic oppression. Captain Williams studied the evidence with the strategic mind of someone who had planned complex military operations in hostile territories. But this was different. This was warfare on American soil, against American institutions, requiring a different kind of precision and a deeper understanding of political consequences. We're not just gathering evidence. We're building a case that's going to tear this department apart and probably bring down half the city government with it. The first contact with Father Michael Washington came through encrypted channels that Ahmed had established with local community activists. The pastor, a former army chaplain who had served alongside Marcus's father in Iraq, brought both spiritual authority and practical knowledge of how to wage campaigns for social justice. Brother Williams, Father Washington's voice carried the weight of decades fighting institutional racism through peaceful resistance. I've been waiting 20 years for someone with your resources to join this fight. These officers have terrorized this community for too long, hiding behind badges while preying on the vulnerable. As night fell over Fayetteville, the pieces of a larger confrontation began aligning like stars in a constellation of conflict. Ahmed's digital warfare had exposed the enemy's weaknesses. Ghost surveillance had mapped their positions. And Father Washington had begun mobilizing community support that would transform individual outrage into collective action. The evidence they compiled built a damning case that revealed not just the assault on Diane Carter, but a pattern of abuse that implicated an entire system designed to protect the powerful while victimizing the vulnerable. And as Ahmed uploaded encrypted files to secure servers and Ghost continued his reconnaissance, both men understood they were no longer just soldiers seeking justice for their brother's mother. They were revolutionaries fighting a war against injustice itself, armed with technology and truth, supported by brothers who would follow them into any battle, and a community ready to rise up and demand the change that had been denied for too long. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg as Colonel William Iron Mike Stevens received the call that would define his career and possibly end it. His best Special Forces unit had vanished from a classified operation, and preliminary intelligence suggested they were operating on American soil without authorization, a violation that could trigger everything from court-martial proceedings to international incidents.
Sir, we have confirmation that Captain Williams and his team are in Fayetteville, Major Richards reported, his voice tight with the implications. They've gone completely dark on official channels, but local law enforcement is reporting unusual activity consistent with special operations surveillance. Stevens felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. These weren't just any soldiers. They were men he had trained, promoted, and trusted with the nation's most sensitive operations. Williams especially was like a son to him, a warrior whose judgment had been proven in countless missions where failure meant death. Prep a military police unit, Stevens ordered, though every instinct screamed against treating his own men as criminals. Full tactical gear, but rules of engagement are minimal force. These are our people, not enemy combatants. Across town, Chief Patricia Morgan faced her own crisis of authority as reports flooded in about military personnel conducting unauthorized operations in her jurisdiction. The viral video of Diane Carter's assault had already created a public relations nightmare, but the presence of Special Forces operators transformed a local incident into a potential federal crisis. Ma'am, we've got eyes on at least 4 individuals with military bearing conducting surveillance on our facilities, Sergeant Davidson reported, his voice portraying the nervousness of someone who understood he might be facing the most dangerous opponents of his career. These aren't regular soldiers. Movement patterns suggest advanced tactical training.
The first confrontation occurred at noon outside the Fayetteville police station, where a crowd of protesters had gathered following Father Michael Washington's call for community action. Captain Williams stood at the center of his team, their military posture unmistakable even in civilian clothing, with military police vehicles approaching with lights flashing. Colonel Stevens stepped out of the lead vehicle with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect in war zones around the world, but his eyes betrayed the personal cost of this moment. Across from him, Williams stood at attention, despite being technically AWOL, their shared history as soldiers creating a silent dialogue of mutual respect and painful duty. "Captain Williams," Stevens called across the space between them, his voice carrying both authority and regret. "You and your team are absent without leave from a classified operation. I need you to stand down and return with me to base immediately." The tension stretched like a wire ready to snap as news crews materialized seemingly from nowhere, their cameras capturing the unprecedented scene of military police facing off against special forces operators in an American city. The crowd of protesters grew larger, their chants creating a backdrop of community anger that threatened to transform the confrontation into something much more dangerous. Williams stepped forward with the precision of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under pressure. "Colonel, with respect, we're operating under moral authority that supersedes our current orders. Mrs. Diane Carter, a military widow and mother of one of my soldiers, was brutally assaulted by corrupt police officers. We're here to ensure justice is served." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before both military and civilian authority, watched by cameras that would broadcast this moment to a nation already grappling with questions about police accountability and military honor. Chief Morgan arrived with backup units, her own authority threatened by the presence of Special Forces operators in her jurisdiction. The scene resembled a three-way standoff from a Western movie, except the stakes were measured in careers destroyed, institutions damaged, and communities torn apart by competing definitions of justice and duty. "This is my jurisdiction," Morgan declared, though her voice carried less conviction than desperation. "Military or not, these individuals are interfering with a police investigation and need to be detained immediately." Stevens felt the weight of history pressing down on this moment, understanding that his next decision would either defuse a crisis or escalate it into something that could reshape civil-military relations for generations. Behind him stood military police ready to arrest some of the nation's most decorated warriors. Beside him stood a police chief protecting a system that had failed its most vulnerable citizens. And before him stood soldiers whose honor demanded they'd choose family over orders. The confrontation became public theater as media attention transformed individual tragedy into national symbol, forcing all parties to escalate their strategies while making compromise increasingly difficult in the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The steps of Fayetteville City Hall had never seen anything like the gathering that formed as word spread through social media channels and church networks about the confrontation between military and civilian authorities. Father Michael Washington stood at the center of a growing crowd, his voice carrying the authority of spiritual leadership and decades of civil rights activism as he transformed individual outrage into collective action. "Brothers and sisters, we are witnessing more than a fight for one family. We are seeing the struggle for the soul of our community, for the dignity of every person who has been silenced by those who abuse their power."
Diane Carter, despite her injuries and against her son's protests, had insisted on attending the rally. She sat in a wheelchair provided by the hospital, her bruised face serving as living testimony to the violence that had brought them all together. The sight of this dignified woman, flanked by her son and his brothers in arms, created a powerful image that photographers captured and transmitted around the world. "I never asked to be the face of anything," Diane spoke into the microphone with the quiet strength that had raised a warrior, her voice carrying across the crowd like a prayer made audible. "I just wanted to get home from work safely, the same as any of you. But if my pain can spare another mother, another daughter, another family from this kind of injustice, then I'll bear witness to the truth as long as God gives me breath." Her words rippled through the crowd like electricity, transforming individual anger into collective determination.
military families stood beside civilian neighbors, Black and white and Latino voices joining together in chants that demanded accountability and change. The presence of Marcus and his Special Forces team added a dimension of protection and legitimacy that transformed protest into something approaching revolution. Maria Santos, the brave neighbor who had recorded Diane's assault, stepped forward with her own testimony. Despite threats and intimidation from unknown sources, despite fears about her immigration status being used against her, she refused to be silenced by those who preferred darkness to light. "I saw everything," she declared, her accented English carrying the fierce determination of someone who had fled oppression only to find it wearing a police badge in America. "I recorded everything, and I will testify to everything, because silence is how evil wins." The crowd grew throughout the day as news coverage spread, drawing supporters from across North Carolina and beyond. Veterans organizations sent representatives, civil rights groups provided logistical support, and ordinary citizens came simply because their conscience demanded they stand with justice against corruption. Ahmed Hassan worked from the crowd, his mobile equipment allowing him to broadcast live feeds and coordinate with sympathetic media outlets. His technological skills ensured that every speech, every testimony, every moment of community solidarity was preserved and transmitted to audiences far beyond Fayetteville. Ghost maintained overwatch from nearby buildings, his training adapted to protect peaceful protesters rather than eliminate enemy targets. Through his scope, he could see the growing tension among police officers assigned to monitor the crowd, their nervousness evident as they realized they faced not just angry citizens, but organized resistance. Captain Williams found himself in the unexpected role of community liaison. His military bearing lended credibility to civilian demands, while his personal investment in justice bridged the gap between institutional authority and grassroots activism. The leadership skills developed in war zones translated surprisingly well to coordinating peaceful resistance. As evening approached, the crowd settled in for what appeared to be a sustained occupation of public space. Tents appeared, food was distributed, and a communication network emerged that could sustain extended protest. Father Washington led evening prayers that drew hundreds of voices together in hymns that had sustained the civil rights movement decades earlier. The image of Diane Carter, surrounded by her son's military unit, protected by a community that had risen to demand justice, broadcast around the world as a symbol of resistance against institutional corruption. Social media amplified their message beyond Fayetteville, beyond North Carolina, creating a national conversation about military families, police accountability, and the courage required to stand against systematic oppression. Political pressure began building on federal authorities as senators and representatives received thousands of calls from constituents demanding action. The local incident had become a national symbol, forcing intervention from levels of government that preferred to avoid such controversies, but could no longer ignore the growing movement for justice. The community had risen, and there would be no going back to the silence that had allowed corruption to flourish in darkness. The federal courthouse in Charlotte had never hosted a crisis quite like this, where military justice and civilian law enforcement collided under the watchful eye of national media. Judge Harold Benjamin, his Navy JAG background evident in the precise way he arranged his papers and studied case files, understood that his next decisions would either prevent a constitutional crisis or accelerate it into something that could reshape American civil-military relations. "This court is faced with an unprecedented situation," Judge Benjamin announced, as attorneys for 3 separate parties filled the mahogany-paneled courtroom. "We have Special Forces personnel absent without leave from classified operations, civilian law enforcement officers accused of excessive force, and federal jurisdiction questions that could affect military families nationwide." Marcus Carter sat in the defendant's section alongside his brothers in arms, their dress uniforms pristine despite the charges against them. Across the aisle, Officer Derek Mansfield and his accomplices fidgeted in their seats, their confidence evaporating under the weight of Ahmed's digital evidence and the community pressure that had transformed their local incident into national scandal. Captain Williams served as spokesman for the unit, his military bearing unchanged even as he faced potential court-martial. Your Honor, we understand the gravity of our actions, but we maintain that protecting military families from brutality is consistent with our oath to defend American citizens against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
The legal complexity was staggering. Federal prosecutors had to balance military discipline against civilian justice, while civil rights attorneys demanded accountability for systematic police corruption. Defense lawyers for the officers attempted to minimize the assault, while military attorneys argued that AWOL charges should be mitigated by extraordinary circumstances. Behind the scenes, political pressure mounted, as senators received thousands of calls from constituents demanding action. The Carter case had become a symbol of military families' vulnerability to civilian authority abuse, forcing federal intervention that politicians preferred to avoid but could no longer ignore. Judge Benjamin's military background helped him understand both sides of the conflict, but the precedent, he said, would affect every military family in America. His decisions about jurisdiction, about the balance between military discipline and civilian justice, about the rights of service members to protect their families, would echo through legal systems for generations. As evidence mounted and testimonies were heard, it became clear that this case would reshape the relationship between military and civilian authority, between federal oversight and local corruption, between individual conscience and institutional loyalty. The walls were closing in on Officer Derek Mansfield, and desperation had transformed him from arrogant bully into dangerous predator. Ahmed's digital evidence had exposed not just the assault on Diane Carter, but years of systematic brutality that painted Mansfield as a serial abuser hiding behind a badge. With his career destroyed and criminal charges looming, he had nothing left to lose and everything to destroy. "Maria Santos needs to disappear," Mansfield whispered to his remaining allies in the department, his voice carrying the menace of someone who had crossed the line from law enforcement into criminality. "Her testimony destroys everything. Without her video, without her witness statement, we might still have a chance." The threats came through anonymous calls and mysterious visitors to Maria's apartment building, men who spoke with official authority about immigration status and deportation proceedings. Fear crept into her daily routines as she realized that recording the truth had made her a target for those who preferred darkness to light. But Maria Santos had not fled violence in her homeland only to be silenced by corruption in her adopted country. "They can threaten me all they want," she told Father Washington during an emergency community meeting. "I have the video, I have the truth, and I will not let them intimidate me into silence." Chief Patricia Morgan faced her own moment of reckoning as federal investigators examined departmental records and internal communications. Years of enabling corruption through willful blindness had caught up with her, and the choice between protecting her officers and saving her own career became unavoidable. "Ma'am," her deputy chief advised quietly, "Mansfield's going down whether we support him or not. The evidence is overwhelming. But if we cooperate with federal investigators, if we help clean house, we might salvage something from this disaster."
The Special Forces Unit felt their own internal pressure as military prosecutors built cases that could result in decades of imprisonment. Some members began questioning whether their sacrifice had been worth it, whether protecting one family justified destroying their own futures. Tommy "Ghost" O'Brien, his Chicago street wisdom cutting through military protocol, addressed his brothers bluntly. "We knew the cost when we made this choice. Mrs. Carter didn't ask us to throw away our careers, but she didn't ask to be beaten by corrupt cops either. We stand together or we fall separately." Community tensions escalated as counter-protesters arrived to support the police, their chants creating divisions that threatened to tear Fayetteville apart. The presence of white supremacist groups and police union militants transformed peaceful demonstrations into potential powder kegs of violence. Ahmed's digital warfare had revealed connections between local corruption and national networks of police misconduct, suggesting that the Carter case was just one symptom of a systemic disease that infected law enforcement across the country. The evidence he compiled painted a picture of institutional rot that reached far beyond Fayetteville. As pressure mounted from all directions, every character faced choices that would define not just their own futures, but the meaning of justice in America. The various pressures created a situation ready to explode into violence or transform into something that could reshape the relationship between authority and accountability. The confrontation came at dawn, when Derek Mansfield made his final desperate gamble to silence the woman whose testimony would seal his fate. Armed and unhinged, he broke into Diane Carter's temporary housing, intent on eliminating the witness whose dignity had exposed his corruption for the world to see. But Mansfield had forgotten that Diane Carter was no longer alone, no longer vulnerable, no longer without protection. Marcus and his team had maintained round-the-clock security, their military training adapted to protect the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise a warrior. "End of the line, Mrs. Carter," Mansfield snarled as he cornered Diane in her kitchen, his service weapon drawn, but his hands shaking with the desperation of someone who knew his world was collapsing. "You should have minded your own business instead of playing victim on social media."
The Special Forces' response was immediate and overwhelming, but Marcus made a choice that would define his character forever. Instead of using lethal force against his mother's attacker, he employed the restraint that separated warriors from killers, disarming Mansfield with precision that left him alive to face justice. "You picked the wrong family," Marcus said quietly, as he secured Mansfield's weapon and waited for backup to arrive. "And you definitely picked the wrong son to mess with." Ahmed's cameras had captured everything: Mansfield's breaking and entering, his death threats, his attempt to murder a witness, providing irrefutable evidence of his criminal intent and complete corruption. The footage would seal not just Mansfield's fate, but validate every choice the Special Forces unit had made to protect their brother's family. Lisa Chen treated Diane's minor injuries from the struggle, while Ghost secured the perimeter and Williams coordinated with arriving law enforcement. The sight of corrupt officer Derek Mansfield in handcuffs, arrested by his own department for attempted murder, created images that would define the resolution of their long struggle for justice. Chief Patricia Morgan personally supervised Mansfield's arrest, her presence serving as symbolic rejection of the corruption she had enabled through years of willful blindness. "Officer Derek Mansfield, you're under arrest for attempted murder, witness intimidation, and violation of civil rights under color of authority." The community gathered outside the courthouse as news of Mansfield's final crime spread through social media and news networks. Father Washington led prayers of thanksgiving that violence had been prevented through discipline rather than escalated through revenge. Judge Benjamin reviewed the new evidence with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice finally served.
Mansfield's desperate attempt to silence his victim had provided the final proof needed to validate every extraordinary measure taken by the Special Forces unit to protect their brother's family. The reckoning had come not through violence, but through the power of truth, the strength of community, and the restraint of warriors who understood that true justice required moral courage rather than physical force. With irrefutable evidence secured and the primary antagonist exposed completely, the path to resolution became clear for all involved. 6 months later, the courtroom that had witnessed unprecedented confrontations between military and civilian authority now hosted the final chapter of a story that had reshaped American conversations about justice, accountability, and the price of doing what is right. Officer Derek Mansfield sat in orange prison clothing, his arrogance replaced by the hollow stare of someone whose world had collapsed completely. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding him guilty on all counts: assault under color of authority, civil rights violations, witness intimidation, and attempted murder. His sentence of 25 years in federal prison sent a message that badges could no longer shield brutality from consequences. Chief Patricia Morgan had resigned in disgrace. Her career ended, but her conscience finally clear after cooperating with federal investigators to expose the systematic corruption that had infected her department for decades. The reforms she helped implement before leaving office would serve as a model for police departments nationwide struggling with similar problems. At the military tribunal held at Fort Bragg, Marcus Carter and his Special Forces unit stood at attention as Colonel Stevens read their sentences. Each man received a reduction in rank and forfeiture of pay, but their honorable discharges recognized the extraordinary circumstances that had driven their actions. "Gentlemen," Judge Benjamin addressed them in his final ruling, "you violated military law, but you upheld military honor. Your actions demonstrated that the oath to protect American citizens extends beyond foreign battlefields to domestic injustice. While I cannot excuse your methods, I cannot condemn your motives." Diane Carter had transformed from victim to advocate. Her quiet dignity and powerful testimony inspired legislation that would protect military families from civilian law enforcement abuse. The Diane Carter Act, passed by Congress with bipartisan support, established federal oversight procedures and mandatory reporting requirements designed to prevent future incidents. "I never wanted to be famous," Diane told the packed courtroom during her victim impact statement, her voice carrying the strength that had sustained her through months of legal proceedings. "I just wanted justice for what happened to me and protection for other families who might face the same violence. If my pain prevented someone else's suffering, then every sleepless night was worth it." Marcus accepted his discharge with the same dignity his mother had shown throughout their ordeal. His military career was over, but his purpose had evolved beyond following orders to following conscience. "We swore an oath to defend America against all enemies. Sometimes those enemies wear badges instead of uniforms." The brotherhood forged in combat had survived the test of civilian justice. Ahmed Hassan used his technical skills to establish a non-profit organization dedicated to exposing police corruption through digital investigation. Tommy "Ghost" O'Brien became a community organizer in Chicago, applying military tactical thinking to social justice campaigns. Lisa Phoenix Chen completed medical school and established a free clinic serving victims of police violence. Captain Williams, despite his demotion, remained in the military, his moral courage earning him respect that transcended rank. Colonel Stevens, rather than being punished for his soldiers' actions, received commendation for his handling of an impossible situation that balanced military discipline with human compassion.
Father Michael Washington continued his ministry with renewed energy, the Carter case having provided a template for community organizing that could challenge institutional injustice through peaceful resistance and moral authority. Maria Santos became an American citizen in a ceremony attended by the entire Carter family. her courage in recording and testifying to the truth having earned her the gratitude of a community and the respect of a nation. The small military town of Fayetteville emerged from the crisis stronger and more united. Its police department reformed and its community bonds deepened by shared struggle for justice. The story that began with one mother's brutal assault had evolved into a movement that touched military families, law enforcement agencies, and civil rights organizations across America. As Diane Carter walked down the courthouse steps for the final time, surrounded by her son and his brothers in arms, she carried herself with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had faced injustice and refused to be broken by it. The scars on her body had healed, but the strength in her spirit had grown into something that would protect generations of families who came after her. Justice had been costly, but it had been worth every sacrifice made by every person who chose courage over comfort, truth over silence, and honor over orders. The bonds forged in this struggle would last forever, proving that some things matter more than careers, more than regulations, and more than the temporary approval of those in authority. In the end, they had all learned that true strength comes not from the power to hurt others, but from the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and that real honor is measured not by the medals on a uniform, but by the willingness to sacrifice everything for what is right. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.